Anybody got any particular areas that they would like addressed? Because coming on from behind Sue and Jill, we see that the whole purpose of what we're trying to do is grow food that is worthy of nourishing human beings. And to do that, we have to understand what the proper process is and how to manage that well. At the moment, we've been tempted into using chemical fertilizers, and this began with Justus von Liebig about 150 years ago, where he discovered that when fertility was poor, it was sometimes helped by adding some mineral substance to it. They didn't understand about biological availability at that time. They couldn't see any of the biology that gathers around the root, and they thought that everything that came into a plant had to be in the aqueous solution of the soil and was absorbed through the meristome or the ends of the plant. Today we have learned a lot more, and we're learning more and more all the time, and we're learning much more about the function of the soil food web, or the soil microorganisms and the macroorganisms, and how we've got used to the World Wide Web on our computers. There's also a plant wide web that connects plants all over the place, and they first discovered it with trees, and now they're aware of it with the annual plants, and how plants can help each other along. But the question now is, having put on the water-soluble salts type of thing, that we have compromised the soil biological activity extremely, and we have to then, first of all, rebuild that. Now, in the soil food web, or in the chain of events through the soil microorganisms and macroorganisms, there are 5 what we call trophic layers, or 5 more or less compartments or segments. But what we have to remember is that everything living is somebody else's dinner. There's no end point until it comes to the human being, and then we're usually so toxic we're not fit for anybody's nutrition. And we usually end our lives as a result of over-toxicity to the system, and our physical body collapses. Very few of us actually die of old age. So to come back to the biodynamics, and what Sue was saying before, that we apply these preparations to activate the soil biology, but the real crowning glory of this is when you've built your foundation with your compost preparations and your field sprays, is to enhance the light uptake by the plant so that it can produce sugar and refine any nitrate that comes into the plant into an assortment of the array of 22 amino acids that make up a good quality protein. Now, it's well known in human nutrition that adults require 8 essential amino acids, and juveniles or infants require a 9th one. That is the same for all the animals we farm as well, and so we need to be able to manage the light that enters the plant so that it can do its job in the enzymes and with the photosynthetic centered around the element of magnesium, how to make the sugars. Now, the sugars are really important in this whole chain of events because they are the feeding source or the root colonizing biology live on. And as I said before, every one of them is dinner for somebody else. So this food chain goes then right through the whole 5 trophic layers out to the beetles and the birds and the bees at the end. And so if you disrupt that food chain at any point, you disrupt the whole outcome. But the first and the most important point is to see that there are adequate sugars coming down there from the plant. And this can be regulated in a certain way. And when you're talking biological agriculture, we are talking about not NPK as being the most important ones. Yes, they still remain important, but the really important things are elements like calcium, silica and boron. And so we were talking this morning about how the calcium-silica polarity can be balanced, and we can do that with the preparations that we were discussing this morning. From the calcium's end of the scale, that its activity is assisted by the corn preparation made from cow manure that spends the winter in the sun, winter in the soil. That winter in the soil helps this substance to gather the activity of the winter sun. And that, of course, in different places means different things. And therefore you should, as far as possible, have these things produced locally so that it fits your particular situation as far as possible. On the other hand, we have the quartz that's ground so fine that those of us who still have teeth left can put some between the inner and outer surface of your front teeth and rub it together, and it shouldn't grit. So it's really fine, almost finer than talcum powder. And the finer a particle is, the more edge it has in relationship to centre. And therefore, the more adaptable it is, the more capacity it has to take on what is coming to it from the outside. So for a long time we spoke about genetics, thinking that the genes changed from the centre. Now more lately they're discovering epigenetics and how the genes actually are influenced and changed from the outside. So we need to do that for ourselves rather than having an injection that helps us, an mRNA, to change our genes from somebody else's lab. So we need to do that to ourselves. We need to be self-centered, in other words, self-control and self-managed. We need to manage ourselves before we worry about managing anybody else. And so here we have a crystal that is built by light, by the activity of light. It's usually built in a geode, which means an area of rock that has a hollow space in the side, and where the crystal is not impeded by anything around it, it has each crystal in the world has a particular ideal form. As we said, we've got different plants that have ideal forms. So all the crystals also have ideal forms. The salt, for example, forms in a cube. This forms this way. And in this way, this is showing an example of the etheric formative force that Jill was talking about and was alluded to by Sue, of how that works from the outside. So when a crystal grows, and this is material matter that is growing, but it adds material to it from the outside. And so it grows from the outside, whereas a plant is growing from the inside and pushing out, and then meets the soul force that helps to form in, come in, and puts a limit on it, and that of course varies according to our environment. So we have here those two poles, winter sun, summer sun. So, and that's a very simplistic way of putting it, that that we need to be able to use that as well as the more complex models. And this is about preparing the way for light to pour through the plant into the soil and into our food and into our being. That by helping to grow food that is full of light, and the result is good quality protein and a range of sugars. Now, through this range of sugars, the plant is able to ask for what it wants out of the soil. Now, there's probably between 15 and 5% of a plant's nutrient comes from the soil, the rest comes from the atmosphere, and including the water. And so this balance has to be achieved, and to get that working correctly, one has to have the nutrients available to the plant in the right order. Now, only the plant really knows what it wants at any one time. So by downloading each day a portion of its sugars into the soil to feed the biology, it is messaging that soil biology as to what it would like to balance its nutrition. And the simplistic way I put it is soup kitchen, luxury restaurant. In a luxury restaurant, you can order what you like. In a soup kitchen, a gentleman can come in and they'll say, "Afternoon, sir, how can we help?" "Oh, I'm terribly hungry. What have you got?" "Oh, we've got soup, sir. Would you like a bowlful?" "Yes, certainly." She comes in a little bit later and says, "Madam, how can we help?" "Oh, I'm terribly thirsty. What have you got?" "Oh, we've got soup." "How much would you like?" "Would you like a cupful?" And so whatever's in the soup is what you get, and there's no choice. It's what, you know, in the case of the farmer and the soil solution, it's what the farmer puts on the top dressing, and he puts on what his advisor tells him to put on, and so on. Now, when you have a plant that is developing the sugars well through the light process, the plant is able then to make the sugar that sends the signal through to the soil biology, "Please may I have so much boron, so much phosphorus, so much calcium, so much cobalt," and so it gets what it wants. Now, you know how much happier you feel when you've got what you want, and how you feel when you can't get what you want, no matter how hard you try. You get sad and depressed eventually. First of all angry, and then annoyed, and then angry, and then you get into a rage and throw rocks about, and so this to me is one of the key points of where we're heading with biodynamics, whether it is for plants, for vegetarians, whether it is going on the farm and we're getting milk and meat and eggs and grain and, you know, all these other things that make up the diet that we choose to eat. We should be choosing it because we sense it is what our body actually needs. So this is a sense we need to develop, and it's not one size fits all. Some people need the meat because their digestive system can't cope with getting everything they need out of the vegetables. It could be that they're not getting the right type of vegetables that haven't got it all in, and so they have to eat the meat, milk and so on, like that. So one farm I was working on, there was a chap rocked up to the cow shed, and on the back he said, vegetarian. It's a word for failed hunter. So he was obviously into hunting and meat. Vegetarians might have a word of advice for the hunters as well. But so it's a matter of being able to choice. So luxury restaurant, soup kitchen. What are we going to do for our farms, our plants, our animals? And I've come across quite a few of them where the, even yesterday on the farm, the animals, he said, were on edge and titchy and not comfortable. And I've dealt with conventional farmers like that before, and I've given them the set of biodynamic preparations. For them, I used a homeopathic form because that was easy for them to use. But it is important that we all learn how to make these preparations and make them well, because you can't make anything from them unless you have that good quality base at the beginning. So the day the cows got on to that sprayed pasture, their attitude, their behaviour in the shed and their milking capacity changed just like that in one milking. And so the debt he'd racked up from not feeding his cows the way they should be fed was cancelled out in 6 weeks. And so when you get it right, it can work extremely quickly. And the other thing is that cows have an incredible sense of smell and taste. I've seen them move quickly from a cow shed when they knew that they had a good pasture. That pasture could be a mile away. I've seen them move slowly away from the shed, dawdle away, and the paddock they were going to wasn't really that good. So how do they know? That's a good question. I'll leave that one with you. But they know. And I've seen it time and time again. I've seen pastures where cows have been presented with half the daily break that has been sprayed or looked after properly, treated with biodynamics, and the other half not. And even if the half that is sprayed is in the more uncomfortable, a la windy, cold, they will eat there first, go to the other and see what's available, and then go back and lie down and chew their cud on the sprayed side. And I have seen a situation where a person hadn't been using, there was an organic farm that hadn't been using any biodynamic preparations, and I said to them, you know, they were in trouble. They were going in May, and they had no more grass on their farm than a lawn ready to be mowed. And so for that time of year there should have been grass a foot tall at least, and they had virtually none. So they were put into a paddock, fed hay, and after 2 days they were making mud. When they sprayed the paddocks, and there again this particular person chose to use the homeopathic one, they had the option of either, and so they put the cows into the paddock, and they went to have a look at them after the 3rd day. They were still lying down in grass, and they looked up and said, well, what are you doing here? So we're okay. And so we moved them anyway. And then during that stage, they couldn't keep up with the spraying for all of them, and occasionally they put them in a paddock that hadn't been sprayed. And the cows came up to the gate when he went there with the bale of hay, and he said, hey boss, you made a mistake this time, you're not supposed to be in here. And so their sense of taste of the value of the food is something that we don't really appreciate. I mean, those of you who are mothers know that a little baby tastes right to the tip of its toes, and as we grow up, our sense of taste gradually draws in till eventually it's up in our mouth, or we even lose that in old age. and lose the sense of smell as well. So we don't really appreciate how important it is to have all those things right. And what the biodynamic process gives us is the option to manage. So as Sue was saying, the farm is an individuality. It has its organs, it has its sense of self, and it has its soul life, and it has its physical matter. And these things, if they're all in balance, all is well. If it's out of kilter, it doesn't work all that well at all. And yeah, we can manage that if we have the right tools. There are the tools that we can extend our range of management to enable us to produce what is good for us to eat, and that is the object of all farming, all gardening, all growing of food, is to do that. The other important thing is that while we're talking just about the farm, we need to take into consideration the environment around, in the air and in the water that leaves the farm. And when we are from living in an atmosphere that is 79% to 80% nitrogen, we decide we need some more, and somebody comes along and sells it to us in a bag or a truck, then we can get an overload in our food and pasture and whatever else. And if, in the case of a dairy farm, you get this overload so that the light factor is not adequate to meet the nitrates coming up in the plant, so it can't make amino acids of all of it, and the cows take on nitrates, and the nitrates, of course, are less developed lower down on the plant than at the top. So what the regenerative farmers are doing are grazing the top third, trampling and leaving the other 2/3. So eat a third, leave a third, trample a third. And that sets up a good biological food system along with the sugars and everything else, and it maintains the solar panel for the plants, that they continue to pump sugar, which is 41% carbon, down into the soil. And there's between 20 and 40% each day that the plants make each day goes into the soil to feed the biology. So the better you can manage that high sugar production each day, the better you're going to feed that soil biology underneath and everything in it. So, as once was said for medicine, first of all, do no harm. And that applies to every walk of life in which we live. So, when we have nitrates being ingested by the cow, they go into the paunch, which is an anaerobic digester, and there nitrate is condensed again or turned into ammonia. Now ammonia can get through the bodily tissue quite well, and it gets loaded up into the blood. The kidneys are in charge of blood chemistry and blood volume. So when they get that high nitrogen or urea loading in the blood, they've got to work overtime to get it out again, to purify the blood, along with any other garbage we put on the pasture or on the environment. So their urine has 3 to 4 times as much urea or nitrogen in an ammonium form going out. The chemicals that we've put on the soil have nuked or killed or suppressed the activity of much of the soil biology, so those soil biology can no longer use that nitrogen as a as a food source because they're not there. Some of it will combine with calcium, magnesium, potassium in the soil, but a lot of it can't find anything to bind to because the soil's too acidic. So when there's an excess of moisture, it runs away. Now when it runs into our streams, one of the effects of nitrogen on the fish life is that they can't absorb oxygen. So this negatively affects all aquatic life. If this nitrogen is stripping calcium off the tricalcic phosphate that formed after putting superphosphate on the land, it will free some of the phosphorus, and so your phosphorus, the other major pollutant in waterways, is also released. And so we have these weeds and the suffocation effect going on in our waterways, which is disrupting the fish and the fish's food chain. So now I come from Coromandel, and they're trying to deal with this by rationing the amount of fish that people are able to catch. Certainly, you know, largely mechanised trawling of fish, and where the nets go down and scrape along the seabed is not helping either. But when we are pumping those water pollutants down through our creeks, then we're having a negative effect which affects the whole of our community. And so I think therewith it is important that we get to understand how to grow our food well. Now, Dr. Enfield Pfeiffer has been mentioned before. He discovered as early as 1933 that if this process was conducted properly, of working with the biodynamics and the 501, or which is the silica preparation, the horn silica preparation, was applied early in the morning on rapidly growing pasture, it had the same effect as the other fellow over there putting nitrogen on his pasture, except that the nutrient value of the one that had nitrogen on went less, and the nutrient value of the one that had the silica on improved by 50%, 75% or whatever, somewhere in that range, rather than dropping 50%. So not only do you grow as much grass, but it is much more value from a nutritive point of view to us and our animals. And so that's all part of this balance, why we should be taking an interest in this and doing something about it. We are the centre, we are the I am of our farms, our properties, our gardens, our environment, the spaces we live in. We are responsible. We need to inform ourselves of how it should be done. And just to finish off, I think I'm nearly done. When I was a young lad of 72, I went back to work on a farm again, and my job was to look after the biodynamic aspect of what was going on this farm. And we were getting along, you know, getting things done, gradually getting the sprayers organised to work better. And I was cornered up by one of the other farmers, because the farm I was working on was a flat shelf. It's on the edge of the Manawatu River, and the next shelf up had farms on it as well, and they could look down on what we were doing, so we were like the puppets on the stage down below. And an older farmer who was living up on that other shelf cornered me up one day and he said, "Here, listen here." He said, "I thought you guys weren't allowed to use nitrogen down there. You're organic." And so to him, what we were doing looked as though we were getting the extra growth that's applying nitrogen. and on top of that we were improving the value of the pasture. Now on that farm, as a result of that process, the grazing routine slows down sort of, you know, in the autumn into the winter with the spring calving herd, and we got out to a 90-day rotation, and so the winter milkers, which were only a few at that time, were grazed intensively behind an electric fence, and for some funny quirk of whatever, cows will graze under an electric fence, but they won't put their feet there. I don't know what it is, but they seem to be shy about electric shock or something. And what we found was a layer of worm cast as a solid sheet, the thickness of my finger, about 2 centimetres. No gaps whatsoever, just a solid casting of worm cast. On that farm, at that time, the worms worked for 180 days. So it's that, worm cast. They say worms cast half above and half below that. So that was the potential amount of worm casting. And there was a chap going around and sort of touting the value of worm farms, and he showed a picture of somebody who had an old trailer that was no longer roadworthy, and he put all the ingredients for a worm farm on the sloping deck and said, "Hey, what value worm casts are?" And so I wrote back to him and I said, "Well, how about if we turned the whole farm into a worm farm as well as a dairy farm?" No reply, no visit, no interest. He just went on with his example of the little trailer. And so by doing this, by getting your sugar processes right and your protein processes right, you can grow a farm. And I have a friend who lives near Te Arawa, and he can make a living as a shell milker from 134 cows. The farm we went to yesterday was 850, and it had downgraded from 900 to make a group of people a living. He was making a living that fed his family and his children without her going to work until they grew up and got big enough almost to leave home. And so that was, well, 134 by half of that was his income, and the other half was his father's income. And so it is possible to make these things work for you in a way that is kind to our environment and profitable to the farmers. And that's the message that I want to bring to the farming population today, that instead of, it's almost as though they've sat on a tack, on a chair, and then they start complaining about the pain of it, rather than getting off it and finding a more comfortable position. And so they're going on at the government for creating these regulations that want to do what we've been talking about, cleaning up our farms, cleaning up our environments, making our cows happy, and fixing the depression in our farmers. Because there's one thing that I've had come back to me by farmers that I'm working with: I've never been so happy in my whole farming career.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, any questions?